Welcome to the 251st of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today is a discussion with Jason Kaufman and Jean Kilheffer Hess, creators of the Anabaptist History Today project. This project captures Anabaptist experiences, including those of Mennonite and Amish communities throughout the pandemic. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live weekdays at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics, and please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, April 1st, 2021, there are 2,818,170 deaths from COVID-19 globally. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. The death toll in the United States has climbed to 552,073. In Ireland, 4,687 have died of COVID-19, and in Belgium, it's 23,016 who've died from COVID-19. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic. I'd like to continue that now. The headline is, "I Was Infected," tackles infection with hate and prejudice in age of COVID-19 pandemic. This was written by Her Yun Hee and appeared in the Hankyoreh newspaper in South Korea, March 21st, 2021. In March of 2020, he became confirmed case number 13 in Seoul's Songbuk district. He had contracted COVID-19 while traveling to the United States earlier that month to attend a meeting of the Academic Council on the United Nations system. The virus ended up turning his life upside down. He underwent treatment while in isolation in the hospital, utterly segregated from the outside world. After his discharge, he had to suffer not only from the disease's after effects, but also from the stigma of having been infected. This is the story of So Chang-rok, a professor at the Korea University Graduate School of International Studies and a member of the United Nations Human Rights Commission, and now the author of the book, I Was Infected. In the book, So writes about the things he experienced after being diagnosed with COVID-19. It's based on the notes he kept while hospitalized, as well as writings posted on his social media. The book is divided into 4 parts: his infection pathway, his diagnosis process, isolation in the hospital, and his recovery period after being discharged. In addition to being a narrative of how So's life changed after he contracted an infectious disease, the book could also be seen as a kind of COVID-19 human rights report, penned by a human rights expert who found himself confronted with discrimination and racism and ostracism after being diagnosed. After testing positive for COVID-19, So was ushered into a world of isolation and segregation. Once diagnosed, he had to be hospitalized in a negative pressure ward where patients with contagious diseases are treated. The ward is completely cut off from the outside world. Cameras monitor patients 24 hours a day. In the absence of any suitable treatments, So found himself turned into a lab rat of sorts as he was given malaria drugs and other medications. Every day he suffered from the, quote, terror that I might die and an overwhelming feeling of isolation with nobody near me, unquote. He continued muttering to himself through his 3-week stay in the hospital as he stared at the room's white walls and looked up at its ceiling. He had to take psychiatric medications due to psychological issues, including feelings of dizziness and tightness in his chest. So did not find it easy to talk about his psychological problems with others. I didn't even want to say that I had been infected with COVID-19. I was afraid how people might view it if I talked about developing psychological conditions on top of that, he recalls. Attitudes of discrimination and hatred towards COVID-19 patients only made things more difficult for him. Online, he was barraged with malicious posts, treated as a virus vector simply for having become infected. The focus of the hatred shifted as it spread, starting with the Chinese before being directed in turn to the places and groups associated with infections in South Korea, Daegu and North Gyeongsang regions, the Shincheonji movement, LGBTQ persons, and others. People unwittingly create feelings of fear to protect themselves, So writes. At such times, the hatred that is part of human nature reveals itself. Exhausted by the seemingly endless situation as the COVID-19 pandemic drags on, he wrote, we pin the responsibility on others and become infuriated with people who do not observe disease prevention guidelines. Unemployment has skyrocketed and society has erupted with negative energy, including a feeling of deprivation among young people who had been preparing to find jobs, he wrote. Hatred leads to exclusion and stigmatization. Social stigma is one of the human rights issues that has reared its head amid the pandemic, just as it did during the MERS outbreak in 2015. According to the results of counseling sessions with formerly isolated MERS patients and family members of those who lost their lives, the most difficult experiences had to do with social stigma, owing to mistaken information. They recalled struggling with the suffering of having to stay in the hospital despite having fully recovered, and the frustration of having to stay at home after even being discharged. For Mr. So as well, the fears escalated further after his discharge. He was unable to simply walk the streets due to the possibility of reinfection, the after effects such as dizziness, and the seemingly uneasy way that people looked at him. Even after the government officially announced that people who retested positive were not contagious, Mr. So could sense people avoiding him. Becoming a sort of minority himself gave Mr. So a clearer perspective on the lives of others in minority groups. For this human rights expert, the period of COVID-19 treatment was an intensive experience of learning about actual human rights. He gained a bit more of an understanding of how refugees, disabled people, and LGBTQ people felt when faced with discrimination and exclusion or were confronted with harsh attitudes from others. Mr. So found himself thinking more deeply than ever about how it might be possible for all human beings to live humane lives under every kind of circumstance. He reflected once again on how human rights can only be firmly achieved when based on a foundation of togetherness. While my life until then had been a process of seeking human rights in my head, the experience of being infected with COVID-19 gave me a realization in my heart of what it meant to be humane, he writes. In a March 10 telephone interview with the Hankyoreh newspaper, Mr. So explained, quote, the book's title, I Was Infected, isn't just about my infection with COVID-19, but refers to being infected with the mistaken ideas of society, things like prejudice and discrimination. I want to emphasize that the vaccine for that is human rights education, he added. I hope that reading this book during the COVID-19 pandemic will be an opportunity for people to think about how they can live together with dignity. I Was Infected is the title of the book, and it was written by Mr. So Chang-rok. Okay, we're going to turn to our conversation today. I'm really excited to introduce my guest to you. Let me turn to that. Jason Kaufman is the Director of Archives and Records Management for Mennonite Church USA in Elkhart, Indiana. Along with managing and providing access to the recorded history of the church, he also interprets and raises awareness about Mennonite history for the broader denomination. A graduate of Goshen College, which is a Mennonite college in northern Indiana, he has a master's degree in Latin American history from the University of New Mexico and a PhD in Latin American history from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's also a certified archivist and has a digital archives specialist certificate from the Society of American Archivists. He has a growing interest in oral history and directed his first oral history project in 2019. Jean Kilheffer Hess is executive director of Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. With a staff of 18, 3 museums, and a historic site hosting a home built in 1719 and a native longhouse replica, the Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society interprets Mennonite life and early Pennsylvania history. Jean is a graduate of Messiah University and Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. She's especially energized by collaborative efforts that help people value their own and others' stories, both historical and history in the making. Jean Kilheffer-Hess and Jason Kaufman, thank you so much for joining me on COVID Calls today.
Happy to be here.
We had a couple of technical difficulties at the top, and I really appreciate your persistence as we managed to make the call work out. So life in pandemic technology mode continues on for everybody, but it's really good to see you here. And I'd like to start the way I usually do, just find out where you're calling in from and what the pandemic is looking like there. Jean, can I start with you, please?
Sure. I'm calling in from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and the virus continues to circulate and affect life really in every way. So there's quite a continuing high incidence of spread. And so we're keeping on.
What about vaccine availability there?
Vaccine availability is increasing at a rapid rate, which is exciting. It feels like many of the folks in my networks have had access or are soon getting access to at least the first shot. So that feels different.
There's been some news reporting about that process being a bit slower in Pennsylvania and other places, but of course that may be county by county. Have you experienced that there?
I imagine there is a county by county difference. Lancaster County has turned what had been a mall space into a large vaccination center, and there are other resources as well, and that's getting geared up. So we've been, I guess, lucky. It feels like Lancaster is well served.
Jason, bringing you in, same question. Where are you calling from, and what's the situation looking like there with the pandemic?
Sure, yeah. I am calling from my home in Goshen, Indiana. And Goshen is part of Elkhart County, and currently Elkhart County is in the very high risk category. It was much worse in November and December when hospitals in the area were at capacity. Now the situation is slightly improved. Vaccination is getting rolled out. I think I checked recently, and there's about 13% of the total population is vaccinated in Elkhart County. And just this week, I think on Wednesday, they opened eligibility to any adult over the age of 16 in Indiana. So now it's going to be widely available in the coming weeks. There's actually an interesting wrinkle, though. There's a statewide mask mandate that is set to expire in Indiana next week on April 6th. And so now county officials need to decide whether or not they're going to issue a local mask mandate. So
you might have a mask mandate expire, but a vaccination available for everyone over 16. These overlapping public health orders become very confusing and hard to communicate over time.
It is. It's confusing and kind of hard. It's hard to understand why they would make a decision like that. You know, like why would you lift the mask mandate less than a week after the vaccine is widely available to all adults? So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it doesn't work overnight. Well, thank you both for those updates from where you're calling from. I'd like to just start kind of generally, maybe just to lay out some context for people who might not be as familiar with what the term Anabaptist even means and how that relates to communities in the United States and around the world today. Jason, let me start with you on that. Can you just give us some general context? And then, Jean, I'll turn to you.
Sure. So Anabaptism, Anabaptist is kind of a larger umbrella term for a group of a wing of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. It was called the radical wing of the Reformation in the 16th century, and they were distinguished from other groups by the fact that they practiced adult believers' baptism, hence the word Anabaptism. So like new baptism. And so that was a pretty radical thing at the time to practice adult believers' baptism instead of infant baptism. And so that's where the name comes from. And Mennonites were just one of many branches within that larger group of Anabaptists. And so Mennonites take their name from a Dutch priest named Menno Simons who lived in the 16th century. And so Mennonites descend or trace their history to him. Mennonites are often confused with the Amish. The Amish are another group within that larger Anabaptist movement, and they separated from the Mennonites in the late 1600s. So over the centuries, there have been more than 300 different groups that have emerged that claim Anabaptist identity, and they live all over the world now. I think it's something like 87 countries, and there's over 2 million people around the world who claim Anabaptist identity today.
Thank you for that introduction. Gene, let me just bring you in. Anything that you might like to add to that? And maybe we can talk a little bit also about how Anabaptist communities, like Mennonite and Amish communities, preserve their traditional folkways and how they live in the world today.
Yeah, so some of the other labels for certain parts of the Anabaptist family that some of your viewers or listeners might be familiar with is the Church of the Brethren in Christ, Mennonite Brethren, Hutterites, and then there's a range of Mennonites, Beachy Amish. So just wanted to add a few more of those labels into the understanding. I would say that each Anabaptist community works at maintaining its folkways in whatever ways that community has decided are important, and they decide that together. So one of the key aspects of being Anabaptist is that community is central. And I'm sure we'll talk about it later on this call, but that usually that means lots of being together, lots of seeing each other, lots of doing things together. And of course, COVID-19 has complicated that in some ways. So community, a commitment to peace, adult baptism, and faith being very, very practical, which often takes the form of some kind of service to others, would be some of those key characteristics that are core to almost all Anabaptist groups. So you may be familiar, we'll use Amish for an example. Amish communities have decided that some visual markers are some of the ways that they help maintain their community. So things like transportation and certain clothing styles. Some communities don't invest in the stock market, for example. Like there are just different kinds of markers that help communities stay connected to each other and engage together in their faith and everyday life together.
Having lived in Pennsylvania myself, and been to the Reading Terminal Market and traveled also to Lancaster, and actually been to your facility there and learned about the history there. I was fascinated, of course, to learn that history, coming from Texas myself originally, and so to find pockets of these communities in the United States and other places around the world is just really interesting. And keeping that history alive, of course, must be a pretty constant effort, right, Gene?
Yeah, it's a very dynamic effort. And one of the interesting things about this full spectrum of Mennonite and Amish and other Anabaptist groups is the two places where the various groups often connect and work together is one in history, memory keeping and history keeping and sharing, and then also in disaster response and recovery. So Mennonite Disaster Service is one group that's well known for a place where culturally conservative Mennonites and others, as well as mainstream Mennonites, work together to respond to disasters. So I'm honored to be part of the history field and to be connecting with all those groups in that work together.
Jason, just to bring you back in terms of this, and maybe it's hard to generalize, but just maybe pulling out some common threads in the ways that Anabaptist communities have fared in the pandemic. Some of the things that Gene was talking about, for example, a real commitment to close-knit communities, to being together in worship. Those seem to run a little contrary to how we were instructed to live starting March of last year. That's just one layer of this, I'm sure. Jason, I wonder if you could speak to that issue.
Definitely. I think the communities that I'm in Goshen, I think most of the churches, at least that I've heard of, doing like Zoom virtual church services. And so you're meeting together virtually. And so that's one way that a lot of churches in my area have found to try to continue to be community together, even when we can't be physically in the same space with each other. But there are a lot of other Mennonite and other Anabaptist churches that have continued to meet in person throughout this whole year. And so, yeah, I was just listening to a really interesting discussion that was moderated by by what's her name? Marlene Epp. She's the director of the Institute of Anabaptist and Mennonite Studies at Conrad Grebel College in Ontario. We had panelists representing various conservative Anabaptist groups, and they were talking about the importance of community, which is one of the things that Jean mentioned, and how COVID-19 has kind of limited their ability to do some of those things that they do on a regular basis. And so one of the panelists was talking about older Mennonites in Ontario and how Sunday is like a big community day for a lot of those families in the older community, and so they would have a church service in person, activities in the afternoon, and so many of those communities have continued to do those things, and so I think that has affected, infection rates for those was intergenerational living. A lot of those communities, they don't have the separate family or units that live separately. They would have like 3 different generations living under the same roof, and so you have it just changes the dynamics of risk and exposure to the virus.
Gene, just maybe bringing it there back to Lancaster in that region in Pennsylvania, do these communities have sort of culturally specific approaches to healthcare that might be different from their neighbors who are not Mennonite or Amish?
So I think maybe we should expand the awareness of the Mennonite diversity just one step further to say that in addition to sort of your traditional European heritage folks that you might think of when you think of a Mennonite community, so maybe a more culturally conservative Mennonite community, there are also many individuals of color who are part of the Mennonite church. And so for those culturally conservative communities that we've been kind of referencing here, that's one part of the spectrum, and I'll address that related to healthcare in a moment. But also most Mennonites, or many Mennonites or Anabaptists, you wouldn't know that they were Mennonite or Anabaptist walking down the street. And so many are accessing healthcare the same way as anyone else in the mainstream. So, but of course, the communities that are more visually separate oftentimes are accessing healthcare somewhat differently, and that might represent itself in a preference for treating illness at home, or for doing home births, for example, or for using a local center for births rather than using a hospital. And also, there is some reliance, I think, still on traditional medicine. So the kinds of things that have been carried on generation to generation, and it's how you treat, a basic cold or something like that. So yeah, there would be some differences there.
So you are both the recipients together working as a team you won a grant from Villanova University and the LePage Center for History in the Public Interest, and congratulations on that and on this project that you've been collaborating on, Anabaptist History Today. So let's talk about that a little bit now that we have some of the context here. Jean, let me start with you on that. Tell us about the project, some of the goals, and the kind of work that you're doing.
So the project started actually with a call from Jason. It was his idea, and I'll let him speak a little bit more to that. But I got really excited about a collaborative effort that would invite various Anabaptists to think about their everyday life during this period, and maybe in general, but especially during this unusual period, as something that should be shared in a digital way or in another way and saved, something that can go in the archives. And I know that one of the things that sparked Jason's interest was looking in the Mennonite Church USA archives for the, trying not to use the word Spanish flu, but I'm forgetting the other name for it. looking for what was in the archives related to that experience and finding not as much as he had hoped to find. So we decided to work together to get people excited and invite contributions so that in the future they can understand what it was like for us to live during this period.
That's a classic historian move, Jason, and one that resonates with me. If something's happening right now, let's go back and find 100 years ago and see what people were doing then. And Gene's referencing the 1918 great influenza. Jason, tell us a little bit more about how your ideas got going with this project and what the work is like.
Sorry, Scott, I'm having a hard time. I'm having some connection issues. Could you repeat your
It's
question?
no problem. Why don't you try to go in the stop cam mode, Jason, and see if that helps us a little bit. We'll lose the visual, but we might gain a little bit better connectivity on the audio if you can do that. Okay, let's see if that helps. So Gene was telling us about the origins of this project, and you're looking in the Mennonite archives to try to find some of the history earlier on of how the Mennonites had dealt with the pandemic in 1918. Talk to us about your idea for the Anabaptist History Today project.
Sure. Yeah. So I had been seeing, I've been reading articles about other history-related organizations launching projects to try to capture the experiences and stories of people in their communities. Way back in March and April when things were first kind of starting with all of the quarantines with the pandemic and things like that. And so what it would be like to do something for the Mennonite and Anabaptist community. And Gene and I have been talking already about ways to encourage collaboration between Mennonite and other Anabaptist archives and history organizations. And so we thought that this could be a good kind of pilot project to kind of test out this idea about about trying to pool resources and collaborate between organizations. And so we actually looked into the possibility of joining with another already established project called Pandemic Religion, which is based out of George Washington University. There's a couple professors there who had launched this project, and we're trying to get basically as broad a perspective as they could from any and all religious faiths and how their lives and communities have been impacted by the pandemic. And we considered that, but because we kind of saw this as a pilot project and that could lead to a future collaboration, we decided we wanted to do something on our own. And so that's what we ended up doing. And it's been really a really interesting process so far. And we've been really encouraged by the interest and support we've had from so many different organizations. I think there's 16 different Mennonite organizations that are part of our collaborative.
Gene, could you tell us a little bit about what's being collected? What are people contributing to the project? I've talked to many different historians and anthropologists, archivists over this pandemic on COVID calls who are doing similar kinds of projects. And we have so many pandemic archives developing around the country and around the world. It's really important work right now. I'm sort of curious to know what's making its way into your collection.
I would say some of the themes of types of things that are appearing in the collection are items that revolve around appreciation for the arts. So it might be poetry or some other kind of personal expression regarding how an individual has experienced this time. And then secondly, it would be focused on their church community life. So it could be a glimpse of an outdoor activity that the church was able to share together that would normally be done in indoor space, or just other ways of sharing how people are finding ways to connect, which again is very important to Anabaptists, but doing so with joy and in other new ways. We also have one person who their congregation decided to do an entire oral history project, interviewing individuals of various generations within the congregation about their experience with COVID. And she uploaded all of those oral history interviews to the Anabaptist History Today site. So lots of different kinds of formats, but mostly focused on some kind of artistic expression from personal experience or shared life together.
What about some of the themes of isolation, stigma, concern that people have over loss of time? Are you seeing those reflected as well?
We are, and I think Jason would probably be better able to speak to some of the themes that have been popping up. He's been part of the group moderating the contributions as they come in. So, Jason.
Okay, Jason, let's bring you in just to hear a little bit more about the kinds of themes that are surfacing in the archive. And again, I'm fascinated by the description you've both been giving about the tight-knitted nature of these communities, which means that in times when people have to not be together, that provides stress.
Yeah. So, um, the some of the other, some of the other things that I thought that themes I've noticed have been, well, one that I saw recently that was really interesting was from an organization called Camp Deer Park, which is it's a Mennonite camp out in New York State, but it's owned by 15 different Mennonite churches in New York City. And so it was really interesting last year in March and April and May, when everything was so bad in New York City. I think it was really tough on all the folks who are connected to these churches, not being able to meet in person and being quarantined in their apartments and things like that. And so Camp Deer Park became a place later on in the summer where people could go to get out of the city and just get out into nature. And so they ended up having family camps for families that were connected to these churches to get out. And so that was an interesting one that kind of speaks to the anxiety and stress that a lot of people felt, especially during those early months in quarantine and stuff. Another really interesting one was from the Mennonite Center Development Organization that has partners all over the world. And so they had a really interesting piece that they submitted from service workers in places like Laos and Nepal. And so it was called The View from My Window. And so they would show a short video clip of what it looks like from their window, and then offer a short paragraphs reflection on how the pandemic has impacted their lives and the communities that they're engaging with all over the world. So those were some of the interesting ones that we're hoping to get more of in the coming months.
How do you plan to make this archive available to people? What will be the ways that I'm assuming you'll build it out so that people can access the interviews, but it'd be curious to see how you then maybe aggregate, or, will there be essays written, or how will you move it out into sort of more general circulation? Jean, let me start with you on that.
So everything that appears on the site is immediately available on the World Wide Web to the public. So when someone submits something that they want to share, they choose which of the 15 collaborating organizations, and those organizations are both in the US and Canada, that they want to be responsible for the long-term archiving of what they've submitted. But then beyond that, it becomes available broadly. So yeah, it's currently all available and anyone can access it.
Jason, let me bring you back in just to talk about some of these themes a little bit. And since faith and the shared experience of faith is at the center of Anabaptist experience, as you've described it, I wonder if that theme has come up as well. In dealing with disaster and making sense of the world, turning to faith, challenges to faith seems to be a theme that we see expressed. Oh, we seem to have lost Jason. Maybe he'll rejoin us, but I'm hoping, Gene, this question could be applicable to you as well. And in fact, you were referencing a minute ago the 1918 influenza, and that idea that faith is something that keeps communities together is a strong idea. It's also a space so when there's disaster, people rethink the world and their place in it. I wonder if I don't know if that's popping up in your oral history or more generally in conversations that you've seen in the Anabaptist community, but I'm curious about that.
Yeah, you're right. Faith remains central. And just as you asked about that, it brought to mind that for the congregation that I'm part of, we've had a Zoom worship service on Sundays, but then also early on in the pandemic, there was a separate Zoom session created on Wednesdays, and it's called Community Life. And it's entirely just folks sharing their joys and concerns so that other people can be aware, can feel connected, and also can pray and support them in a variety of ways. So it's just one example of how faith remains central to the experience. One of the things that Jason and I did when we were creating the site is we worked hard on the welcome and sort of introducing what kinds of things we welcome, and that's very broad. So if you go to the website and take a look at the introduction, it says it specifically mentions how your faith has helped you during this time, or maybe how you felt that your faith has not been as helpful as you had hoped it had been. So we're really open to the full range of experience, whether it may feel like you're having a crisis of faith in the midst of all these changes, or if faith has really been a resource that's helped you stay sane and focused.
Jason, I'm glad to see that you've rejoined us here, and I wanted to get your perspective on this. We're talking a little bit about how people in this Anabaptist History Today project are talking more specifically about faith, what they're drawing from faith at this time, but also maybe the way that their faith is being challenged.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. And one of the things that we already mentioned is the strong sense of community. And I think that has also really come through as people have adapted and changed in response to the pandemic. I was just reading the other day, there's an organization called the Mennonite World Conference that is kind of an umbrella organization for Anabaptist and Mennonite communities of faith all around the world, and they created a COVID support fund. It's kind of it's like a mutual aid fund for congregations, Anabaptist congregations and organizations that have been affected as a result of the pandemic, whether it's through job loss or other types of other crises that have happened in response to the pandemic. And to date, I think it said that Mennonite World has distributed over almost $500,000 in aid to various groups around the world. And so that's another example of how faith and this tradition of mutual aid has informed Anabaptist and Mennonite responses to the pandemic.
That's a really important theme and something we've heard a lot about in the pandemic, and I've talked with many guests about mutual aid communities. And Gina, would sort of bring you into that. I mean, how does that actually work on the ground, either in ways you've heard people talk about it in the project or just in your own life and observation? What kinds of services are people providing in a sort of community mode instead of relying on outside social services or outside financial assistance?
Often a very practical way that mutual aid happens is sharing food. So this is not unique to Mennonite communities, but when someone is struggling and indicates they need assistance or support, getting together and making sure they have meals delivered on a regular basis so they can focus on whatever it is that they're dealing with is a key way. Other kinds of practical concerns like transportation or childcare or the kinds of things that people do in community together. For culturally conservative groups, mutual aid has a much more structural it's more structurally in place for a variety of things in life, not just emergencies, but things like, not purchasing commercial insurance, for example, so that there's this clear understanding that when someone faces a loss, that the community shares their financial resources. So that's been a long tradition, those kinds of more formal mutual aid approaches. But when it comes to pandemic and everyday life, it's usually leaning on, the community life Zoom that I mentioned, in the congregation or something like that. And then the practical needs can be met by folks in the congregation.
One of the things that the pandemic has revealed and provoked, unfortunately, is the inequalities in American life too. And as members of what is a religious minority group, even among Protestants, I'm sort of curious how that's been surfacing as well. Jean, I want to start with you on this just because there's been, and I don't know how widespread this is, there was some reporting throughout last year that in Lancaster County, local officials there got sort of drawn into rejecting the governor's orders on mask mandate and things like that. It struck me that maybe that reporting had picked up one little thing and tried to build a world around it. I don't really know, but I am curious how Anabaptists may be experiencing stigma, maybe even violence at this time, a sense that they're isolated because of the social tensions that the pandemic has created.
I've not personally been aware of any violence pointed at or connected with Anabaptist communities in the Lancaster area. Fortunately or unfortunately, all the same fault lines that we see everywhere else in society with regard to politics and with regard to various perceived spots on the spectrum also exist in Anabaptist and Mennonite communities. So yeah, we're experiencing all the same kinds of push and pull conversations within congregations and within and between groups.
Just a reminder, you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking to Jean Kilheffer Hess and Jason Kaufman about their project Anabaptist History Today, and they're winners of the Villanova University LePage Center History in the Public Interest Grant. They've been telling me about this project. We have a couple of minutes left, Jason, just to come back to you. And I wonder, it's just sort of a general question, but what do you think that non-Anabaptists, so people who may be just learning about these communities for the first time today, what would they draw from this collection? I think we're still having a little audio
Sorry, Scott,
difficulty.
on Anabaptist.
Yeah, more generally, what will people draw from this collection to understand how Anabaptists are dealing with it? Or, yeah, I'm sort of interested in that, sense. It's not only for the Anabaptist community.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I hope that project people will be able to learn about the diversity of the Anabaptist community. I think there's a lot of questions, especially about the Amish and Mennonites. And so hopefully this project can give people a sense of where are Mennonite and Anabaptists? What are they doing in response to the pandemic? How are they trying to live their lives and continue to share their lives together in community under circumstances where it's often pretty hard to do that. And so I think that is one thing that I hope comes through with this project. Yeah, I think that's probably the main thing. That's what I would say, at least, is that the Anabaptist community is kind of what Jean mentioned a few minutes ago. The Anabaptist community has a lot of distinctive features, but then there's a whole range of there's a whole spectrum of belief and practice, and so I think that's
Thanks,
that's what I would
Jason.
say.
Same question to you, Gene. Just, how do you expect people to use this collection within maybe the Anabaptist community, but also outside? What should others take away from it, do you think?
I think it offers an opportunity to really get to that core of learning our own and others' stories across boundaries. So for various Anabaptists all across the U.S. and Canada and even the world, it's comforting, it's interesting, and it brings joy to get a glimpse into how someone else is living in these days and what keeps them going and how they stay connected and engaged. But I'm also aware that there's often a perception from those who aren't Anabaptist or who are just learning about what Anabaptism or Mennonites and Amish, what it is, that it's kind of closed, that it's a community with very strict boundaries. And I know that when people drive by the Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society, there's often this impression that, it's a society, it's very much not a place I'm necessarily going to stop in and be welcomed. So I hope that folks beyond the Anabaptist communities can feel welcomed and can feel like they can have sort of a no-risk place to get a glimpse into what life is like for those of us who choose to live committed to this faith and lifestyle.
Thank you for that point. And I'm really impressed by that because we've heard a lot in this last year and we've seen a lot of what drives people apart. And I was asking you just a moment ago about the tensions and stigma that may, reach into the Anabaptist community as well. But I'm also really moved by this idea. I mean, the pandemic, and we saw this last March and April more effectively, I think, it is a collective moment as well. So people across faith groups and non-faith groups are grappling with all of the concerns, fears, economic stresses of the pandemic. Strikes me, that idea of somebody driving by the Historical Society, Gene, they don't have to be Anabaptist to come in and get a sense of what your community has faced. I think that's an important bridge to build.
Yeah, it's an exciting place to be sort of recognizing in each other, common humanity and lots of common experiences, while also being interested in learning about what's distinctive and why does it matter to you. And yeah, I think that's an important way to connect.
Just closing out, Gene, just to ask you that at the Historical Society there, the Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society, of which you're the director, do you expect that some of these materials will actually become part of exhibits or more sort of standing features that guests will interact with? I know it's pretty early in the project still, but I'm always fascinated how, experts like yourself are going to bring these into wider circulation.
Yes, I hope that what's being shared through Anabaptist History Today can become part of longer-term communication. And specifically on our campus, we have a location called the Mennonite Information Center, which is really about welcoming tourists and welcoming guests. And I can see a number of the things that have been shared through Anabaptist History Today becoming communication points or story nuggets that we can share with the broader world in that way.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I just want to also thank Jason Kaufman, and I want to thank Gene Kilheffer-Hess, the co-producers of the Anabaptist History Today project. And just a reminder, you can catch their project. I put up the link a minute ago. You can find it pretty easily online and watch for those oral histories and those essays and the things that are going to flow from that. Jason, I'm sorry we had a few technical issues there, but thanks for your insights from Indiana. And Gene, thanks for calling in from Pennsylvania. It's good to be with you both. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live every weekday, 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll end this discussion now, but please join me back in just a few minutes. I'll be starting a second COVID Calls session today. I'll be talking with Alex J. Goldstein, the founder of the Faces of COVID site. That site's coming up on a year of history, and I'll talk with Alex in just a few minutes. Gene and Jason, thank you so much. Stay healthy.
My pleasure.